The morning of April 28, 1908, broke cold and damp over the flat farmland outside LaPorte, Indiana. The sky still bruised purple at its edges when Joe Maxson smelled smoke drifting through the cracks of his quarters above the carriage house. By the time he stumbled barefoot across the muddy yard, the two-story brick farmhouse was already consumed, flames roaring from every window, the heat so intense it pushed him backward like an invisible hand. In the cellar, after the fire crews finally beat back the blaze, investigators found 4 bodies huddled together in the ashen ruin, 3 children, their small frames curled as if sleeping, and beside them, the corpse of a woman. But here was the detail that would haunt LaPorte County for the next century. The woman had no head. Her skull was never recovered from the debris, not that morning, not in the weeks of excavation that followed. And when workers began digging in the hog pen behind the barn 3 days later, following the desperate pleas of a Norwegian farmer searching for his missing brother, they unearthed something far worse than anyone had imagined. A bone, then another, then the unmistakable curve of a human rib cage, and then, in a trench no deeper than 4 feet, the dismembered remains of at least 11 human beings, wrapped in burlap, some still wearing the clothes they had traveled in from states as far away as Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Missouri. Belle Gunness had placed advertisements in Scandinavian newspapers across the Midwest, describing herself as a lonely widow seeking a husband. Men had answered those advertisements. They had come to this farm with their life savings, and not a single one of them had ever left. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The woman who would become the most prolific female serial killer in American history was not born with the name Belle Gunness. She arrived in the world as Brynhild Paulsdatter Størset on November 11th, 1859, in the small fishing village of Selbu, Norway, nestled in a valley where the mountains rose steep and dark against winter skies that barely lightened for months at a time. Her father, Paul Pedersen Størset, was a stonemason who scratched out a modest living building foundations and walls for the wealthier families in the region. Her mother, Berit, bore 8 children, of whom Brynhild was the 6th. The family was poor in a place where poverty meant something visceral, hunger that gnawed through the coldest months, clothes passed down until they were more patch than original fabric, a single-room cottage where the warmth of bodies was the only reliable defense against the Nordic freeze. What little we know of Brynhild's childhood in Norway comes filtered through decades of later investigation and the unreliable memories of elderly relatives interviewed long after her crimes had made international headlines. But certain facts emerge consistently. She was, by all accounts, a physically imposing girl even in her youth, tall for a woman, broad-shouldered, with hands that would later be described as capable of work that exhausted grown men. She was clever in ways that the formal schooling available to a stonemason's daughter could not accommodate, possessing a sharp understanding of money, of human weakness, of the way that need could be leveraged into control. And there was an incident, whispered about for years in Selbu, and later repeated to American investigators, that may have been the crucible in which her capacity for violence was first forged. In 1877, when Brynhild was 17 or 18 years old, she attended a country dance in a neighboring village. The details vary in the telling, but the core remains consistent. A young man from a wealthy family, his name lost to history but his status well remembered, approached her at this dance. What happened between them, whether it was a sexual assault, a brutal beating after she rejected his advances, or something else entirely, left Brynhild pregnant, and according to some accounts, resulted in a miscarriage brought on by the violence of the encounter. The young man faced no consequences. His family's position in the community shielded him completely. Within months, this same young man was dead, his passing attributed to a stomach ailment that came on suddenly and lasted only days. There is no proof that Brynhild Størset poisoned this man. There never would be. But the coincidence was noted by those who knew her, and it would take on darker significance years later, when American authorities began counting the bodies and tracing the patterns backward through time. What is certain is that after this incident, something in Brynhild changed. She became more guarded, more calculating, more focused on a single goal: escape from Norway and the poverty that had defined her existence. Her older sister, Nellie, had emigrated to the United States in 1881, settling in the growing Scandinavian community of Chicago. The letters Nellie sent home described a city of unimaginable scale, of opportunity that seemed boundless compared to the frozen limitations of Selbu. In 1881, Brynhild followed her sister across the Atlantic, traveling in steerage class on a ship whose name has not survived in the records. She arrived in America with almost nothing. A few pieces of clothing, perhaps a small amount of money saved from years of domestic work in Norway, and an ambition that burned with the intensity of those who have known true deprivation. Chicago in 1881 was a city still rebuilding from the Great Fire of a decade earlier, its streets a chaos of construction, immigration, and the raw energy of industrial capitalism in its most unregulated form. The Scandinavian neighborhoods on the near north side teemed with Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish immigrants who had come seeking the same promise that had drawn Brynhild, a chance at something more. She found work as a domestic servant, cleaning and cooking in the homes of families whose comfort was built on the labor of girls like her. She learned English quickly, though she would retain her Norwegian accent throughout her life, the vowels rounded in ways that marked her as foreign even after decades in America, and she changed her name, shedding Brynhild Sturset like an old skin and emerging as Belle, and later Belle, a name she felt suited her ambitions better. For 3 years, Belle worked in the households of Chicago's professional class, saving what she could from her meager wages, observing the ways that wealth operated, the mechanisms by which comfortable people maintained and expanded their comfort. She saw how property was held, how insurance worked, how money flowed from one generation to the next through wills and estates. She saw, too, how vulnerable certain people were. Widowers, lonely men, immigrants who had not yet learned the subtle hierarchies of American society. These observations would prove useful. In 1884, Belle married for the first time. Her husband was Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a night watchman at a department store. Mads was by all accounts a decent, hard-working man without particular ambition or distinction, exactly the sort of steady, reliable partner that a young immigrant woman was expected to choose. They set up housekeeping in a small frame cottage on Alma Street, on Chicago's west side. And Belle, now Belle Sorensen, settled into the role of wife and eventually mother. The Sorensens would have 4 children together, though the details remain murky. 2 daughters, Caroline and Axel, sometimes recorded as Lucy and Myrtle in later documents, possibly different children, possibly the same children under different names, seem to have been biological. Others may have been foster children taken in for the small payments the county provided. The family's financial situation was always precarious. Mads earned barely enough to keep them fed and housed, and Belle chafed against this limitation with increasing bitterness. Then, in 1896, their fortunes changed in a way that would establish a pattern repeated again and again over the following decade. The Sorensens had purchased a small confectionery shop on Grand Avenue, hoping to supplement Mads' income with the profits from candy sales. The shop struggled. Customers were scarce, and the Sorensens lacked the capital to stock inventory or advertise. But on the shop was an insurance policy, and shortly after the business opened, it burned to the ground under circumstances that investigators found suspicious, but could not prove were arson. The insurance paid out, providing the Sorensens with their first significant capital. This would become Belle's method, refined over years and applied with increasing boldness. Insurance, death, profit, repetition. The insurance money from the candy shop fire allowed the family to move to a better home in Austin, a neighborhood on Chicago's western edge that was then still semi-rural, with large lots and a population that mixed working-class Scandinavians with families of somewhat greater means. They purchased a house at the corner of Alma and Elizabeth Streets, and here, for a time, the Sorensens lived a life that approximated respectability. But Belle was not content. She had tasted the way that catastrophe, properly insured, could transform circumstances, and she began to see disaster not as something to be feared, but as something to be engineered. The children fell ill repeatedly, stomach aches, convulsions, symptoms that in retrospect bear an uncomfortable resemblance to arsenic poisoning. 2 of them died, and on each, Belle had taken out insurance policies in the weeks before their deaths. The payments were small, a few $100s each, but they added up. They also, apparently, went unnoticed by authorities who had little reason to suspect that a grieving mother could be anything other than what she appeared. Then, on July 30th, 1900, Mads Sorensen died. The official cause of death was heart failure, though the symptoms he exhibited in his final hours, severe stomach pain, convulsions, the rapid deterioration of a man who had been in apparent good health, were consistent with strychnine poisoning. The attending physician, Dr. Charles Jones, initially expressed suspicion and suggested an autopsy. But another doctor, apparently at Belle's request, intervened and diagnosed the death as due to an enlarged heart. No autopsy was performed. The life insurance companies paid out 2 policies whose overlapping coverage dates just happened to coincide on the day Mads died, resulting in a combined payment of $8,500, the equivalent of nearly $300,000 in today's money. Belle Sorensen, widow, was suddenly a woman of means. She had 2 surviving children, the girls who would later be known as Myrtle and Lucy. Whether these were the same children born to her and Mads, or different children adopted under these names, and a sum of money sufficient to change her life entirely. She chose to leave Chicago, to remove herself from any lingering questions about her husband's death, and to start fresh somewhere that her history was unknown. She found that somewhere in LaPorte, Indiana, a small city of about 10,000 people located 70 miles east of Chicago along the railroad line. LaPorte was prosperous in a quiet way, surrounded by rich farmland, home to several small industries, and a county seat whose courthouse anchored a downtown of brick commercial buildings. More importantly for Belle's purposes, the area around LaPorte was home to a substantial population of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who had settled the land and established farms, creating a community where a Scandinavian widow would not seem out of place. In 1901, Belle purchased a 48-acre farm on McClung Road, about a mile north of the city limits. The property included a 2-story brick farmhouse, several outbuildings, a barn, and pasture land suitable for raising hogs. She paid $500 in cash, a substantial sum that attracted attention in the community, as did the fact that this strong, well-dressed widow had appeared seemingly out of nowhere with 2 young daughters and no husband. Belle explained that she was a widow from Chicago seeking a healthier environment for her children. She seemed respectable, industrious, pious enough to attend the Norwegian Lutheran Church on Sundays. She fit in. Within months of establishing herself in LaPorte, Belle began searching for a new husband. Her method was calculated and efficient. She placed advertisements in the matrimonial columns of Scandinavian-language newspapers that circulated throughout the Midwest, the Skandinaven in Chicago, the Decorah Posten in Iowa, and others. These newspapers served as social networks for immigrant communities spread across vast distances, connecting lonely farmers in Wisconsin with widows in Illinois, linking Swedish loggers in Minnesota with Danish seamstresses in Nebraska. The matrimonial columns were respectable enough, used by thousands of lonely immigrants seeking partners who shared their language, their Lutheran faith, their understanding of the old country's customs. Belle's advertisements were carefully crafted. She described herself as a comely widow with a prosperous farm, seeking a hard-working man of Norwegian background who could help her manage the property. She emphasized her financial security, her good health, her desire for companionship in her later years. She was 41 in 1901, no longer young but not yet old, in the prime of her productive life. And she mentioned always that a prospective husband should be prepared to contribute to the household, to bring some capital of his own that might be combined with hers for their mutual benefit. The responses came by the dozens. Men wrote from farms across the prairie states, from lumber camps in Michigan and Wisconsin, from the Norwegian colonies of Minnesota and the Dakotas. They were lonely men, many of them, widowers whose wives had died in childbirth or of disease, bachelors who had never found partners in communities where women were scarce, older men seeking comfort and companionship as they approached the end of their working years. They wrote of their savings, their property, their desire for a home and family. They sent photographs of themselves in their Sunday best, standing stiff and serious before painted backdrops in photography studios. They trusted that the widow who had advertised was what she claimed to be. Belle responded to the most promising prospects with letters that were warm, encouraging, subtly seductive. She wrote of her loneliness, her desire for a strong man to help her with the farm, her vision of a comfortable life shared between two people who had both known hardship and deserved better. She was, by the standards of the time, remarkably forward in her correspondence, hinting at physical intimacy in ways that would have been scandalous if her letters had become public. And she always asked about their financial situation. How much had they saved? Did they own property? Would they be willing to bring their capital to the marriage, to combine it with hers so that together they might prosper? The men who took the bait traveled to LaPorte by train, carrying their life savings in cash or bank drafts, dressed in their best clothes, nervous and hopeful. Belle met them at the station, this tall, imposing woman with her broad shoulders and her watchful eyes, her manner warm but somehow appraising. She drove them out to the farm in her buggy, pointing out the fields, the livestock, the comfortable house that would be their home if the courtship went well. She served them elaborate meals. Belle was, by all accounts, an excellent cook, and she charmed them with visions of the life they might share. And then, one by one, they vanished. The first documented victim after Belle's move to LaPorte was not a suitor, but a husband. In April 1902, Belle married Peter Gunness, a Norwegian immigrant from Wisconsin who had answered her advertisement and found her promises compelling. Peter was a widower with 2 daughters of his own, a farmer who had sold his property in Wisconsin to start fresh with this prosperous widow he had found through the matrimonial columns. He brought his savings, his furniture, his children. He moved into the farmhouse on McClung Road and became, briefly, the head of a blended family that included his daughters, Belle's daughters, and a new infant son named Philip, who was born the following year. Peter Gunness survived less than a year. On December 16, 1902, Belle appeared at the home of a neighbor, distraught and weeping, to report that her husband had been killed in a terrible accident. According to her account, Peter had been reaching for something on a high shelf in the kitchen when a heavy meat grinder, kept on the shelf above the stove, had fallen and struck him on the head, crushing his skull. He had died almost instantly. Belle was inconsolable, or appeared to be. The neighbors who gathered to offer comfort noted the strange trajectory of the fatal object. The awkward physics of a meat grinder falling in just such a way as to kill a man. One of Peter's daughters from his first marriage, Jenny, who was 14 at the time and had been in the kitchen when the incident occurred, reportedly told authorities that she had seen Mama kill Papa with the meat grinder. But Jenny was young, her English was imperfect, and the coroner, faced with a grieving widow and no obvious evidence of foul play, ruled the death accidental. Belle collected the life insurance and became Belle Gunness, widow, sole owner of the farm, mother to 3 children, Myrtle, Lucy and the infant Philip, and unofficially guardian to Peter's daughter Jenny, whom she kept on the farm rather than returning her to relatives in Wisconsin. The other daughter, Swanhild, was sent to live with family in Wisconsin. Jenny remained. Why Belle kept Jenny has been the subject of speculation for over a century. Perhaps she needed the girl's labor on the farm. Perhaps she feared that releasing Jenny would invite questions about what the girl had witnessed. Perhaps there was some darker purpose that has never been established. What is known is that Jenny remained on the farm until sometime in 1906 or 1907, when she disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. Belle told inquiring neighbors that Jenny had been sent to a finishing school in Los Angeles, that she was doing well, that she wrote regularly. No evidence that Jenny attended any school in California was ever found. When investigators began digging in the hog pen after the fire, one of the first sets of remains they uncovered was tentatively identified as Jenny Olson. After Peter's death, Belle settled into a pattern that would continue for the next 5 years. She managed the farm with a steady stream of hired hands, men who came and went with unusual frequency, some of whom were later identified among the bodies in the hog pen. She continued to place advertisements in the Scandinavian newspapers, corresponding with dozens of lonely men across the Midwest, inviting the most promising to visit, to bring their savings, to imagine a future with the prosperous widow of Laporte. And she continued to acquire, to accumulate, to gather unto herself the small fortunes of men who trusted her. The suitors arrived throughout 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, and 1907. Some of their names are known, many are lost. John Moe from Minnesota came to Laporte in the early days of Belle's widow hunting and was never seen again. Henry Gerholt of Wisconsin arrived with a gold watch and several $100s. His family received a letter, apparently in his hand, but almost certainly dictated by Belle, explaining that he had decided to travel further west and would write when he had settled. He never wrote again. Olaf Svenherud vanished after traveling from Indiana to meet the widow. Olby Budsberg, a widower from Wisconsin, brought his life savings of over $1,000. His sons eventually came looking for him and found no trace. The pattern was consistent enough that it should have attracted attention, but in an era before centralized law enforcement databases, before easy communication between police departments in different states, before the kind of systematic tracking of missing persons that would develop in later decades, the disappearances went unnoticed. Each man's family assumed he had moved on, perhaps embarrassed at a failed courtship, perhaps chasing some other opportunity. The families were scattered across the prairie states, separated by hundreds of miles, unaware that their missing relatives had all traveled to the same farm in Indiana, had all answered the same advertisement, had all brought their savings to the same woman. Belle's farm prospered during these years. She added to her livestock, improved her buildings, hired workers to expand her operations. Neighbors noted that she was unusually wealthy for a widow running a farm alone, that she seemed to have access to capital that her farming income could not explain. They noted, too, that she had an unusual number of visitors, men who arrived by train and were picked up by Belle in her buggy, men who stayed for days or weeks and then departed without saying goodbye, without stopping in town to catch the train home. Some neighbors talked, wondered, speculated. But Belle was a respectable widow, a churchgoer, a member of the community. Such women did not commit crimes. Such women were not dangerous. The hired hands were another matter. Belle burned through farmhands at a rate that raised eyebrows. Men who worked for her for a few weeks or months, and then abruptly quit, or so she claimed. Some of these men may have been legitimate employees who found her demanding manner and strange hours intolerable. Others, investigators would later conclude, never left the farm alive. Among those identified from the remains in the hog pen were at least 2 men who had worked for Belle as farmhands, their bodies buried alongside the Suitors, the distinction between categories of victim apparently irrelevant to the woman who had killed them all. The logistics of Belle's operations were remarkable in their grim efficiency. She was a large woman, over 200 pounds by most estimates, with the strength that came from years of hard physical labor. But disposing of a body, or multiple bodies, required more than strength. It required time, privacy, planning, and a system. The evidence suggests that Belle had all of these. Her farmhouse was isolated, set back from the road, surrounded by fields and outbuildings that blocked any view from neighboring properties. She kept hogs, dozens of them by some accounts, and hogs will eat almost anything, including human remains. The areas where bodies were later found had been regularly disturbed, the earth dug and refilled, the signs of burial hidden by the normal activity of a working farm. How Belle killed her victims remains somewhat unclear, though the evidence points toward a combination of methods. Some victims were almost certainly poisoned, their symptoms consistent with arsenic or strychnine, substances that were freely available at any pharmacy for pest control, and that Belle was known to purchase in quantities that exceeded any reasonable need for a farm her size. Others may have been drugged into unconsciousness and then killed by more direct means: bludgeoning, stabbing, suffocation. The remains found in the hog pen showed evidence of dismemberment, the bodies cut into pieces for easier burial and faster consumption by the hogs. This required knowledge, tools, and the stomach for close, bloody work. Belle, who had butchered her own livestock for years, apparently had all three. Among the identified victims whose stories can be reconstructed with some completeness, a few stand out. John Moe, an older bachelor from Minnesota, came to LaPorte sometime in 1903 or 1904 with nearly $1,000 in savings, hoping to find a wife who would share his remaining years. His family lost contact with him shortly after he mentioned in a letter that he was going to visit a widow in Indiana. Olby Budsberg, a widower from Iola, Wisconsin, came in 1907 with his life savings. His sons grew concerned when they stopped receiving letters and eventually traced his movements to LaPorte, where they found that their father had cashed a large bank draft shortly after arriving. The bank officials remembered him, a quiet, elderly man who had converted his savings to cash at the request of the woman who accompanied him. But the victim whose disappearance would ultimately unravel Belle's operation was Andrew Helgelian, a prosperous farmer from Aberdeen, South Dakota. Andrew was 47 years old in 1907. A bachelor who had accumulated substantial savings from his wheat farming operations, but had never married. He was lonely, growing older, thinking about the future. He answered Belle's advertisement, and the correspondence that developed between them was more extensive than most. Belle's letters to Andrew were preserved by his brother Asl, and they reveal the calculated nature of her seduction, the careful building of intimacy, the gradual introduction of financial themes, the gentle but persistent requests for proof of his seriousness, which she defined in terms of the money he was prepared to bring. Andrew wrote back with increasing enthusiasm. He described his farm, his savings, his desire for companionship. He sent a photograph of himself, a stocky, serious-looking man with a mustache and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. Belle responded with encouragement, with flattery, with carefully calibrated expressions of affection. By late 1907, Andrew had decided to sell his property and move to Indiana to marry the widow who had captured his heart through the mail. He arrived in LaPorte in January 1908, traveling by train from South Dakota with his life savings, reportedly between $2,000 and $3,000, sewn into a money belt under his clothes. He had arranged for the remainder of his property sale to be wired to a bank in LaPorte once the transactions cleared. He wrote to his brother Asl, describing the widow's prosperous farm, the comfortable house, the welcome he had received. He wrote that he expected to marry Belle soon, that he was happy, that he had found what he was looking for. That letter was the last anyone heard from Andrew Helgelien. Asle Helgelien waited through February and March of 1908, expecting to receive news of his brother's wedding, or at the very least, another letter with updates on his situation. Nothing came. Asle wrote to the address Andrew had provided, the farmhouse on McClung Road, and received a strange reply. Belle Gunness wrote back, explaining that Andrew had left the farm some weeks earlier, saying he intended to visit relatives in Norway before returning to marry her. She was as surprised as Asle to have heard nothing, she claimed, and she was growing worried. Perhaps Andrew had been delayed. Perhaps something had happened to him during his travels. Asle was not satisfied. His brother had no relatives in Norway worth visiting, and Andrew had never mentioned any plans to travel abroad. The letter's explanation made no sense. Asle wrote again, more insistently, demanding to know what had happened to his brother. Belle's replies became evasive, her excuses increasingly implausible. By April 1908, Asle had decided to travel to Indiana himself to investigate his brother's disappearance in person, to confront this widow who seemed to know more than she was saying. He arrived in LaPorte on May 4th, 1908, 6 days too late. The farm had already burned, the bodies had already been discovered, and the investigation that would make Belle Gunness infamous across America and beyond was already underway. The fire that destroyed the Gunness farmhouse broke out in the early morning hours of April 28, 1908. Joe Maxson, the hired hand who had been working for Belle for about a month, was awakened by the smell of smoke around 4:00 a.m. He was sleeping in a room above the carriage house, a converted quarters separate from the main house, a detail that likely saved his life. By the time he reached the farmhouse, the fire was fully involved, flames pouring from every window, the heat too intense to approach. He ran to a neighbor's house to raise the alarm, and within the hour, fire crews from LaPorte had arrived, though there was little they could do beyond preventing the blaze from spreading to the outbuildings. When the fire was finally extinguished, and investigators could safely enter the ruins, they found 4 bodies in the cellar. 3 were children, identified almost immediately as Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, Belle's daughters and son, aged 11, 9, and 5, respectively. They lay together, as if they had been sleeping when the fire began, their small bodies largely consumed but still recognizable. The 4th body was an adult woman, assumed to be Belle herself. But this body was different. It lay several feet from the children, positioned strangely, and most disturbingly, it had no head. The missing head became the central question of the investigation. Fire investigators noted that the blaze had been hot, certainly, but not hot enough to completely consume a human skull, while leaving the rest of the skeleton largely intact. The woman's body was found with its arms at its sides, a position inconsistent with someone who had died while conscious and struggling against the flames. There were no teeth scattered in the debris, no skull fragments, no evidence that the head had been present at all when the fire consumed the house. And then there was the question of size. The headless corpse was smaller than Belle Gunness, significantly smaller, perhaps weighing only 150 pounds in life, compared to Belle's documented 200 pounds or more. Sheriff Albert Smutzer and his deputies initially assumed the fire was accidental, a tragedy that had claimed a widow and her 3 children. But even before Asle Helgelien arrived, demanding answers about his brother, suspicious details were accumulating. The fire appeared to have been set, possibly in multiple locations. Kerosene had been found splashed on the cellar stairs, and neighbors, now willing to share suspicions they had kept to themselves for years, began telling stories about the widow's many suitors, the men who came and went and were never seen again, the strange hours she kept, the way she had been seen digging in her yard and hog pen at odd times of night. When Asle Helgelien arrived on May 4th, he went directly to Sheriff Smutzer with his concerns. He brought his brother's letters, including the correspondence from Belle that described Andrew's supposed departure for Norway. He brought bank records showing that Andrew had withdrawn his life savings before traveling to Laporte. He brought the photographs of Andrew that Belle had sent him, and he demanded to know where his brother was. Smutzer, already growing uneasy about the circumstances of the fire, took Assel's concerns seriously. He obtained permission to dig on the farmhouse property, focusing first on the hog pen behind the barn, an area that several neighbors had mentioned seeing Belle work in at unusual hours. On May 5, 1908, workers began excavating. They did not have to dig far. Within the first hour, they uncovered a burlap sack buried about 3 feet down. Inside the sack were the dismembered remains of a human body. A torso, arms, legs, separated at the joints, the flesh partially decomposed but still recognizable as human. By the end of the first day, they had found 4 more sets of remains, each buried in its own shallow pit, each showing signs of dismemberment. One set was identified almost immediately. Andrew Helgelian, recognizable by his distinctive build and by personal effects found with the body, including a watch chain and a belt buckle his brother confirmed as belonging to him. The excavation continued for weeks. Workers dug up virtually the entire hog pen, then expanded to other areas of the property, behind the barn, in the vegetable garden, in a corner of the orchard. The body count rose steadily. 11 sets of remains were recovered by mid-May, and the total would eventually be estimated at anywhere from 11 to over 40, depending on how fragmented the remains were counted. Some bodies were identified through personal effects, dental work, or the testimony of family members who had come searching for missing relatives. Others remained anonymous, their identities lost, their families perhaps never knowing that their missing husband, brother, or father had met his end in a hog pen in Indiana. The investigation pieced together Belle's method through a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and the correspondence she had left behind. Letters found in the ruins of the farmhouse documented her relationships with dozens of men across the Midwest, the careful progression from initial contact through courtship to invitation. Bank records showed large deposits in Belle's accounts following the known arrival dates of various suitors. Neighbors testified to seeing men arrive at the farm who were never seen leaving. Farmhands recalled being asked to dig holes or haul heavy loads wrapped in burlap that Belle explained away as animal carcasses or agricultural waste. The portrait that emerged was of a methodical, patient predator who had perfected a system for identifying, luring, and killing victims over a period of at least 5 years and possibly longer. Belle had used the isolation of her farm, the trust of the Scandinavian immigrant community, the desperate loneliness of unmarried men, and the inadequacy of early 20th century law enforcement to commit murder on a scale that stunned the nation. But the central question remained unresolved. Was Belle Gunness among the dead? The headless corpse found in the cellar presented investigators with a problem they could not solve. The woman's body was significantly smaller than Belle, 5 feet 3 inches, according to the coroner, compared to Belle's documented height of 5 feet 8 inches. The weight estimates were similarly discrepant. Neighbors who viewed the remains could not positively identify them as Belle's, and indeed many expressed doubt that the body was hers at all. But if the woman in the cellar was not Belle, then who was she? And where was Belle? Ray Lamphere, a former farmhand who had worked for Belle until she fired him in February 1908, became the primary suspect in the fire. Belle had accused Lamphere of stalking her in the weeks before the blaze, and she had obtained a restraining order against him, claiming she feared for her safety. Lamphere was arrested within hours of the fire and charged with arson and murder. He was a troubled man, given to drinking and to erratic behavior, and he had publicly expressed anger toward Belle after his dismissal. The case against him seemed strong, but as the investigation progressed, Lamphere's role became more complicated. Some evidence suggested he had indeed set the fire, either alone or at Belle's direction. Other evidence pointed toward Belle herself as the arsonist, having staged her own death and killed an unknown woman to serve as her substitute in the flames. Lamphere's own statements were contradictory. At his trial, he maintained his innocence of the murders. Those, he suggested, were Belle's work alone, while offering ambiguous accounts of his involvement in the fire itself. The trial of Ray Lamphere took place in November 1908, before a jury that had been hearing about Belle Gunness and her crimes for 6 months. The prosecution argued that Lamphere had set the fire that killed Belle and her children, whether out of jealousy, revenge, or some other motive. The defense argued that Belle was alive, that she had staged her own death, killed a substitute, and escaped with a fortune estimated at anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000, the combined savings of years' worth of victims. The jury's verdict was a compromise that satisfied no one. Guilty of arson, not guilty of murder. Lamphere was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he would die of tuberculosis in 1909. Before his death, he reportedly made a confession to a fellow prisoner, a minister named E.A. Schell, in which he admitted to helping Belle dispose of at least 40 bodies over the years he had worked for her. He also, according to Schell, revealed that Belle was alive, that she had fled the night of the fire, that the woman whose body was found in the cellar had been killed specifically to serve as a decoy. Lamphere claimed he had driven Belle to a predetermined location where she had disappeared, presumably to start a new life elsewhere under a new identity. Whether this confession was true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated has never been determined. Schell had every incentive to sensationalize his account, and Lamphere had every incentive to save himself from guilt by deflecting responsibility onto a woman who might be dead and certainly wasn't present to contradict him. But the details of his account matched what investigators had found too closely to be dismissed entirely, and the question of the headless corpse remained unanswered. In the years following the fire, sightings of Belle Gunness were reported across the country and around the world. She was seen in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York, in Minneapolis, in small towns across the Midwest, where large Scandinavian women drew second glances. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Investigators followed leads that took them from coast to coast, interviewing women who resembled Belle's description, tracking down tips that invariably led nowhere. Belle Gunness, if she survived the fire of April 28, 1908, had vanished as completely as her victims. But the investigation did produce one piece of evidence that seemed, at the time, to settle the question. On May 19, 1908, a boy named Louis Schultz was sifting through the ashes of the ruined farmhouse when he discovered something small and hard among the debris. It was a dental bridge, a piece of false teeth made of porcelain and gold, partially melted but still recognizable. Louis brought the bridge to investigators, who contacted Belle's dentist, Dr. Ira P. Norton. Norton examined the bridge and confirmed that he had made it for Belle Gunness, that its distinctive construction matched his records exactly. The bridge, he testified, had been cemented into Belle's mouth and could not have been removed without significant effort. This should have settled the matter. If Belle's dental bridge was found in the ashes of her home, then Belle herself had almost certainly died in the fire. The coroner's jury, convened to determine the identity of the headless corpse, accepted Norton's identification and ruled that the body was Belle Gunness. But doubts persisted. The location where Louis Schultz claimed to have found the bridge had already been thoroughly searched by investigators. The bridge itself was in surprisingly good condition for an object that had supposedly been through a fire hot enough to consume a human skull. And Louis Schultz was the son of a man who worked for the LaPorte County Sheriff's Office, raising questions about whether the discovery was genuine or had been staged to close the case. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson died in Los Angeles while awaiting trial for the poisoning death of her employer, a wealthy elderly man named August Lindstrom. Investigators looking into Carlson's background discovered a number of striking similarities to Belle Gunness. She was Norwegian, approximately the right age, heavy-set, with a history of associations with men who had died under suspicious circumstances. Photographs of Carlson were sent to Laporte, where people who had known Belle examined them and offered conflicting opinions. Some believed Carlson was Belle, others were equally certain she was not. Carlson died before any definitive identification could be made, and she was buried in Los Angeles, her identity never established with certainty. The mystery of Belle Gunness, like the mystery of so many other serial killers who vanished before their capture, has never been completely solved. The evidence strongly suggests that she killed at least 14 people and possibly more than 40 over a period spanning 2 decades. The evidence regarding her death is more ambiguous. She may have died in the fire of April 28, 1908, her head consumed or separated from her body by causes unknown. She may have escaped, leaving behind a substitute corpse, and lived out her remaining years under an assumed name in California or elsewhere. She may have been Esther Carlson, still killing into her 70s, or she may have died anonymously in any of 100 places where a large, aging Norwegian woman would not have attracted particular attention. What is certain is that the farm on McClung Road, that quiet property outside Laporte, where Belle Gunness advertised for husbands and received them with all the hospitality she could muster, was one of the most prolific killing grounds in American history. The men who traveled there from across the Midwest, carrying their life savings, dressed in their Sunday best, hopeful and lonely and trusting. These men walked into a trap from which none of them emerged. They answered an advertisement, believing they might find love. They found only death and burial in a hog pen, and an anonymity so complete that many of them remain unidentified to this day. The Gunness farmstead itself was demolished in the decades following the fire. The land eventually absorbed into other properties, the brick foundation filled in and covered over. For years, curiosity seekers came to Laporte, seeking the site of the murders, and locals grew weary of giving directions to a place that no longer existed in any meaningful form. The hog pen where the bodies were found became a cornfield, then a housing development, the geography of murder erased by the ordinary processes of development and time. But the story of Belle Gunness persisted, becoming part of the folklore of the Midwest, a cautionary tale about the dangers of loneliness and the capacity for evil that could hide behind the most ordinary facades. She was referenced in songs, in plays, in true crime accounts that have been published continuously for over a century. She became, in some tellings, a figure of dark comedy, the Lady Bluebeard, who had solved the problem of incompatible suitors by eliminating them altogether. In other tellings, she remained what she had always been, a murderer of terrifying efficiency, a predator who had exploited the vulnerabilities of an immigrant community and the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement to kill without consequence for years. The suitors who vanished at her farm, John Moe, Ola Budsberg, Andrew Helgelien, and a dozen or more whose names are lost, deserve to be remembered not as victims of a macabre entertainment, but as human beings whose lives were stolen from them. They were farmers and laborers, widowers and bachelors, men who had worked hard their entire lives and had hoped, in their later years, to find companionship and comfort. They trusted a woman who promised them these things, and she killed them for their money. Their families, too, deserve remembrance, the brothers and sons and nephews who came searching for missing relatives, who refused to accept the easy explanations, who persisted until the truth was finally uncovered. Asle Helgelien, whose dogged pursuit of his brother's fate led directly to the excavation of the hog pen and the discovery of the bodies, spent years trying to recover Andrew's remains and give him a proper burial. He eventually succeeded, transporting his brother's body back to South Dakota for interment. But the trauma of what he had learned never fully left him. The investigation of the Gunness murders was a landmark in the development of American forensic science and law enforcement. The techniques used to identify the remains, comparison of dental records, analysis of personal effects, reconstruction of bodies from scattered parts, were at the cutting edge of what was possible in 1908. The coordination between law enforcement agencies in different states, while still primitive by modern standards, established precedents that would be expanded in subsequent decades, and the intense public interest in the case helped to create a market for true crime journalism that would only grow over the following century. But the case also exposed the failures of the system. Belle had operated for years without detection, killing victim after victim while her neighbors looked away, and her community gave her the benefit of the doubt. The loneliness and isolation of immigrant life in the rural Midwest had made her victims vulnerable. The fragmentation of law enforcement had made her invisible. Each family assumed their missing relative had simply moved on, and no one connected the dots until it was far too late. The landscape of rural Indiana in 1908 was a landscape of isolation, of farms separated by miles of road, of communities bound together by church and language and culture, but disconnected from the larger world. A woman could live on a farm outside town, could receive visitors, could bury bodies, could conduct commerce in human flesh, and her neighbors might notice oddities, but would hesitate to act on their suspicions. Respectability was a shield that could deflect the most obvious questions, and Belle Gunness had cultivated her respectability with the same care she had used to cultivate her garden and fatten her hogs. The Scandinavian immigrant community that Belle exploited was a community particularly vulnerable to her predations. These were people who had left everything familiar behind, their language, their customs, their family networks, to build new lives in an unfamiliar land. They clustered together for comfort and mutual support, reading the same newspapers, attending the same churches, trusting one another in ways that they might not have trusted native-born Americans. Belle used that trust, embedding herself in the community, speaking Norwegian, attending the Lutheran church, presenting herself as one of them. Her victims came to her because she was familiar, because she reminded them of home, because she seemed to understand what it was like to be an immigrant in America. The matrimonial columns that Belle used to find her victims were themselves a product of the particular circumstances of immigrant life. In the old country, marriages were arranged through networks of family and community, through introductions at church events and village gatherings, through the slow accumulation of reputation and trust. In America, these networks were shattered, the communities scattered across a continent, the old systems for making matches no longer functional. The newspapers stepped into this gap, offering a way for lonely people to find one another across distances that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The system worked for many. Thousands of happy marriages were arranged through matrimonial columns in the immigrant press. But it also created opportunities for exploitation that someone like Belle could not resist. The financial dimension of Belle's crimes was as calculated as everything else about her operations. She specifically targeted men with savings, men who had something to bring to the marriage, men whose disappearance would produce immediate profit. The amounts involved were substantial for the time, a few $1,000s from each victim, enough to accumulate a small fortune over the years of her killing spree. By the end, she may have collected $50, $1,000 or more from her victims, a sum that would be worth well over $1 million today. Whether this money went up in the fire of April 28th, or whether Belle escaped with it and lived out her days in comfort, is another question that has never been answered. The farm itself, in the weeks following the discovery of the bodies, became a macabre tourist attraction. Thousands of people traveled to LaPorte to see the site of the murders, to walk around the grounds, to peer into the pits where the bodies had been found. Entrepreneurs sold postcards, photographs, and souvenirs. Local hotels and restaurants did booming business. The intensity of public interest surprised even the most cynical observers. This was, perhaps, one of the first instances of what would later be called dark tourism, the phenomenon of traveling to sites associated with death and tragedy. The newspapers covered the Gunness case obsessively, devoting front-page headlines and multiple columns to each new development. The Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Daily News, the Indianapolis Star, and papers across the Midwest competed for the most sensational angles on the story. Belle was alternately portrayed as a monster, as a criminal mastermind, as a figure of dark humor, and as a symbol of everything that could go wrong in the new, mobile, modern America. Her crimes became a lens through which the anxieties of the era, about immigration, about gender roles, about the dangers of the lonely hearts trade, could be examined and ultimately contained. For the people of LaPorte, the Gunness case was a trauma that shaped the community for decades. They had lived beside a murderer without knowing it. They had nodded to her at church, bought goods from the same merchants, shared the same public spaces. The revelation that evil could hide so effectively behind such an ordinary face was deeply unsettling. Some residents retreated into denial, insisting that Belle must have been someone else, that such things could not happen in their community. Others embraced the notoriety, recognizing that the Gunness case had put LaPorte on the map in a way that nothing else ever had. The legacy of the Gunness case extends far beyond LaPorte and far beyond 1908. Belle Gunness became a prototype for a certain kind of serial killer, the Black Widow, the lonely heart's predator, the woman who used domesticity as a cover for murder. Her methods, refined over years of practice, established a template that would be recognized in subsequent cases. The financial motive, the isolation of victims, the exploitation of trust, the careful disposal of bodies. She demonstrated that women could kill as efficiently and as ruthlessly as men, a lesson that some investigators still struggle to accept. The case also established lasting questions about the nature of evil and the conditions that allow it to flourish. Belle Gunness was not born a murderer. She was born a poor girl in a Norwegian fishing village, with the same hopes and fears and needs as anyone else. Somewhere along the way, she became something different, something capable of killing not once, but dozens of times, not in passion, but with cold calculation. What made her into what she became? The violence she allegedly suffered in Norway, the poverty and deprivation of her childhood, the insurance payouts that taught her that death could be profitable, the isolation of the American frontier, where a woman could do as she pleased if she was careful enough. These questions have no clear answers, but they remain relevant. Every age produces its predators, and every age produces the conditions that allow them to operate. Belle Gunness was a product of her time, of the disruption of immigration, the loneliness of the frontier, the limitations of early law enforcement, the opportunities created by new technologies like the mass circulation newspaper and the railroad. Understanding her requires understanding that context, recognizing that serial killers do not emerge from a vacuum, but from the specific circumstances of their moment in history. The victims of the Gunness farm have largely been forgotten, their names preserved only in legal documents and historical records that few people consult. They were ordinary men mostly, farmers and laborers who had accumulated modest savings through decades of hard work, and who hoped to spend their remaining years in comfort with a companion who would share their lives. They deserved better than what they received. An unmarked grave in an Indiana hog pen, their bodies dismembered and scattered, their identities erased. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in a macabre body count, but as human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths were tragedies. Andrew Helgelian, the South Dakota farmer, whose disappearance prompted the investigation that finally exposed Belle's crimes, was buried in his home state after his brother Arsel recovered his remains. His grave marker, which still stands, notes the circumstances of his death, but offers no elaboration, no explanation of the chain of events that led a lonely bachelor to travel halfway across the country, seeking love and finding only murder. Andrew's story could be the story of any of Belle's victims: hope, trust, betrayal, death. But because his brother refused to give up, because Assel persisted in his search for answers, Andrew's death meant something. It led to the discovery of the others, to the excavation of the hog pen, to the exposure of a criminal enterprise that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The hog pen itself, that small enclosure behind the barn where Belle kept her pigs and buried her dead, has become a symbol of the case. The physical location where the reality of her crimes was finally revealed. The pigs were participants in her system, whether deliberately or not. They consumed evidence, disposed of remains, made her murders harder to detect. The image of Belle Gunness feeding her hogs in the early morning light, while the bones of her victims lay just beneath the surface of their pen, is one that has haunted American true crime ever since. In the end, what happened at the farm on McClung Road remains partially unknowable. We know that Belle Gunness killed many people. How many exactly will never be determined, but certainly more than a dozen, and possibly more than 40. We know that she operated for years without detection, protected by the limitations of her era and the trust of her community. We know that her crimes came to light only because of the persistence of one man, Asle Helgelian, who refused to believe that his brother had simply vanished. And we know that the question of whether Belle herself escaped justice remains unanswered more than a century later. The farm is gone now. The brick farmhouse burned in 1908 and was never rebuilt. The outbuildings have long since rotted away. The land has been absorbed into other properties, subdivided, developed, covered over with houses and roads and the ordinary infrastructure of suburban life. Nothing visible remains to mark the site where perhaps the most prolific female serial killer in American history operated her enterprise of murder. Only the records survive: court documents, newspaper clippings, photographs, and the testimony of witnesses long dead, to remind us of what happened in that place. And somewhere, perhaps, Belle Gunness herself survives, if not in body, then in the questions that have never been answered about her fate. Did she die in the fire of April 28, 1908, her head separated from her body by causes unknown? Did she escape, fleeing with a fortune in stolen money, living out her days under a new name in some distant place? Was she the mysterious Esther Carlson, who died in Los Angeles in 1931, still killing into her 70s? Or did she simply vanish as completely as her victims, swallowed up by the vastness of America and never seen again? The answer, like so many answers in this case, remains lost. The Suitors who came to the farm on McClung Road brought their hopes, their savings, their dreams of a better life. And they left nothing behind but bones in a hog pen. Belle Gunness took everything else: their money, their identities, their lives, and gave back only mystery. The farm where the Suitors vanished has itself vanished now, but the questions it raises persist, as troubling and as unanswerable as they were on that cold April morning when Joe Maxson smelled smoke drifting through the cracks of his quarters and stumbled out into the dawn to find the farmhouse consumed in flames and the bodies of 4 people. Or perhaps only 3 people and 1 carefully staged corpse lying in the ashes. The story of Belle Gunness is, in the end, a story about the darkness that can hide in plain sight, about the capacity of human beings for evil and the conditions that allow that evil to flourish. It is a story about loneliness and exploitation, about trust betrayed and innocence destroyed. It is a story about the limitations of justice and the persistence of mystery. And it is a story that, more than a century after the events it describes, still has the power to disturb, to fascinate, and to remind us that the past is never as safe as we imagine it to be. The men who vanished at Belle Gunness's farm came from across the American heartland, from South Dakota and Wisconsin, from Minnesota and Missouri, from Illinois and Indiana, and states beyond. They were drawn by advertisements in newspapers that promised companionship, by letters that offered affection, by the prospect of a comfortable life with a prosperous widow who seemed to understand them. They packed their belongings, withdrew their savings, bought train tickets, and traveled to LaPorte, Indiana, to a farm on McClung Road where a woman was waiting for them. They arrived hopeful. None of them left. The farm is gone now. But the story remains. The earth of LaPorte County has long since settled over the secrets it once held. The brick foundation of the Gunness farmhouse crumbled decades ago, reclaimed by grass and time and the relentless forward movement of a world that does not pause to remember its dead. Where the hog pen once stood, where the bodies of lonely men were stacked like cordwood beneath the Indiana soil, there is now nothing. No marker, no monument, no acknowledgement that this ordinary patch of ground was once soaked in blood. But the dead do not require monuments to persist. They persist in the records that bear their names, in the photographs that preserve their faces, in the letters they wrote to families who never saw them again. They persist in the questions that have never been answered, and in the silences that stretch across more than a century of wondering. Andrew Helgelian persists, and John Moe and Ola Budsberg, and all the others whose names we know and the many more whose names are lost forever. Belle Gunness, too, persists. Not as a woman, but as a mystery, as a question mark that hangs over the American past, like smoke over a burning house. She was here, she killed, she may have escaped. And then she was gone, vanished into the vastness of a country that was still learning to count its dead. The loneliness that drove her victims to answer her advertisements has not disappeared from the world. The desperation that made them vulnerable still exists, still creates opportunities for those who would exploit it. The darkness that Belle Gunness embodied was not unique to her time or her place. It is a human darkness, present in every age, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to emerge. What remains, finally, is this. A farm that no longer exists. A woman who may or may not have died. And a collection of bones that were once men who wanted nothing more than to be loved. They came to Indiana seeking companionship. They found a grave instead. And in that terrible exchange, hope traded for death, trust rewarded with murder, lies the enduring horror of what happened at the farm, where Belle Gunness's suitors vanished, one by one, into the hungry earth of the American heartland. Their silence echoes still,